But governments have a lot of leverage as well, and we understand that. And we understand that our impact can be felt in this outward way or kind of behind these closed doors way. I would say in terms of the way that we deal with this in general terms is very much the way media organizations deal with this in terms of sort of advertising. We have a kind of advertising wall. You know, there's a kind of space in a newsroom where you have advertising and where the news happens. We have a similar way of dividing the way our work is done inside crime. We tell all of our clients that if any of them try to interfere in what we're doing, then the contract is off, it's over, we're done. So we do not permit any interference whatsoever in what we do, no matter the product that we're doing. So we try and separate any means of trying to influence what our product is. And again, we're very often in sync. Sometimes it can be difficult, but I'll leave it there, and we can talk more in the Q&A if you want.
Thanks very much. I'll turn next to Debra LaPrevotte for more insight from both the law enforcement and the investigative perspective. So from your 20 years with the FBI and now 7 years as an investigator with the Sentry, what would you say to those in the journalist or activist world about the oftentimes one-way street in discussions with law enforcement?
Well, you know, it's very interesting because I talk to people all the time, and they say when we talk to law enforcement, you know, we don't get much feedback. We don't get a one-way street. You know, it is a one-way street. They want information. They don't share anything. Well, first of all, speaking as a former FBI agent, we're not allowed to share. So if they are sharing, they're violating DOJ policy. But the point is that you are getting information. When you share information with the U.S. State Department, with Treasury, with law enforcement, you're getting the names of people of interest into their databases. So what a lot of people don't understand is that if you're an NGO, if you're civil society, if you're a journalist, we are listening. And I, as an FBI agent, I opened investigations based off a news report or off of somebody from an NGO coming to say, hey, I have this information. I can tell you, I have some of my Nigerian colleagues in here today. Years ago, Global Witness came and sat down with DOJ and the FBI and said, hey, we want to tell you about a $1.1 billion Nigerian oil deal. And I opened an investigation. And also, what a lot of NGOs and investigative journalists don't realize, because they feel that some of they reported on it and it didn't go anywhere. It didn't go anywhere yet, because there is always a big turnover in kleptocratic regimes. So if you look at, Bashir's out of office. Yahya Jammeh is no longer the president of, gosh, I'm drawing a blank. Yeah, exactly. The evidence you collect today and you think didn't go anywhere may very well be the evidence that's used later in a court case. After the Dos Santos family left Angola, a journalist handed me a list of 400 companies linked to Isabel Dos Santos. I called the FBI and said, hey, here's what I got. I want to share this with you. Don't shoot the messenger, because now you have to look up 400 companies. But you don't know the value of what you're collecting. And also, law enforcement can't be everywhere. So like now I work South Sudan. I can tell you really nobody in US law enforcement's deeply looking at South Sudan. So to have an NGO, a journalist, the OCCRP, ICIJ, all these other wonderful groups collecting evidence, data, witnesses, getting their hands on documents that were never made public, that information can be turned over, can be used as evidence, can help bring civil forfeiture and criminal cases against people. So, collect the data, collect the evidence, get your hands on things that aren't otherwise available. I now work for an NGO. I can travel without letting a country know I'm coming. If I were still FBI, I'm a representative of the United States government, and I have to let them know I'm coming. So I can do, there's where I desperately miss subpoena authority because I want bank records. What I can do is I can now fly into South Sudan, I can meet with sources, I can fly under the radar, I don't have to let anybody know I'm coming, and I can accomplish some things that I couldn't do as an FBI agent. Well, the FBI can certainly do a lot of things that I cannot do as an investigator.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to address the next question to Myra Martini. So Transparency International does important work trying to hold the corrupt accountable. One of the ways that you do this is by developing legal submissions for law enforcement. So could you provide the civil society perspective on challenges to legal accountability work and working with law enforcement and policymakers?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much for the invitation, and good afternoon to everyone. So at Transparency International, as a civil society organization, what we want to see is accountability. We want to see those that are involved in corruption being held to account. And the way we work, we have been trying to understand what are the challenges, why we have this level of impunity that we have. And I would say we could have three pillars of challenge. I would group them in three big challenges. I think the main one is related to inadequate legal framework. And then here we can list different things, from some countries not even having criminalized some types of corruption, to immunity rules that would prevent some public officials from being prosecuted, to rules related to statute of limitation, for example, that are so short in some countries that would also prevent investigations to happen when we finally get hold of evidence. And then I'll talk about challenges related to the resources that authorities have. It's not uncommon to see law enforcement authorities and FIUs really poorly resourced. And here is about financial resources, about staff, is about access to technology and tools to do their work. So for example, earlier in the year, we published a study that looked into the resources available to financial intelligence units, which is crucial to detect suspicious, that can then later be investigated by law enforcement authorities. And we found in the US, for example, each staff member of FinCEN, the US FIU, need to go through more than 10,000 suspicious transaction reports. So assuming that everyone in FinCEN does this, which is not the case. So it's even higher than that. And it's the same with law enforcement. There is one case of BAA in Sweden. You had 1.5 prosecutors working on this case that involved a bribe of a lot of resources that have been lost. And I think finally, a crucial one, and is one that we are trying to overcome with a lot of creativity, I would say, is undue influence. You have a lot of law enforcement authorities in different countries that are not independent, not autonomous, and are just not simply having the space to do their job or are fully captured to do their job. So what we are doing at Transparency International, and the GAC project enables us to do that very well, is exactly what Deb was saying, is packaging the information that is coming from journalist investigations to submit that to law enforcement authorities and other competent authorities across the world. And one way that I said we have to be creative is that we need to look for jurisdiction, because very often the country that is involved is a country that we face some of these challenges I just talked about. So we try to map out where else we would try to find at least some level of accountability. And that's what we have been doing with these investigations, with some success, although in many cases we still don't know, right? It's too early to tell.
Okay, thanks. And now your partner in the GAC, Drew Sullivan. So you've built a powerful network, global network of investigative journalists exposing crime and corruption with the OCCRP belief that it takes a network to fight a network. Are there recent investigations that would help us to appreciate some of the challenges that you face in exposing transnational corruption in particular, and how have you tried to overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, really, really every story. It's extremely difficult to do work, but just to give you a sense of, one case in 2017, we were looking at a group called the 'Ndrangheta, which is the Calabrian mafia. And it's one of the most powerful organized crime gang in the world, probably. And they were owning a tremendous amount of real estate, which they still own, in eastern Slovakia. And we were tracking a story about how a newly appointed special advisor to the president turned out to be a 20-something-year-old topless model whose business partner was a major Ndrangheta figure. And this is the prime minister's, personal advisor. It was an incredibly difficult story because organized crime is hard to track. They don't advertise themselves as organized crime. And getting access to records is very difficult in many countries. And with offshores and everything, you can't always do it. And in the process, the reporter we were working with in actuality, a Slovakian newspaper was murdered. This is the ultimate difficulty and the ultimate problem of investigative reporting. When you get to the point where, you anger people to the point where they feel that they can kill you. And it's incredibly difficult from a journalism standpoint to deal with these types of problems. And, we ended up throwing every reporter we could on it, and Pavla Holtsova, who's here today in the fourth row, led a team. She'd been working with Jan on these stories, and she led a team to finish Jan's work and to report the stories. But that only led to much more serious problems. Pavla was actually, she found out later, a suspect in the murder by the Slovak police. They confiscated her mobile phone for a long period of time and tried to crack into it, which they were not successful. And then eventually, as we continued working, Pavla was able to get the complete set of investigative files that the police had, because somebody was worried that when the government changed, when the elections came up, that everybody associated with the investigation would be purged from the government and the whole case hidden. And so, that caused a problem of having 70 terabytes of data. And how do you get, reporters to work on 70 terabytes of data, on short deadlines in complicated, investigations into murder and into bribery. And it turns out that, they were able to get dozens of police and prosecutors and judges and others fired, because what it really revealed was that the whole government of Slovakia was an organized crime gang led by the police, who was really controlling a lot of things. And this is the problem. We catch 2% of the crimes out there, maybe 1% of the crimes. There's a lot more stuff going on, and we're only catching pieces of it. And law enforcement is only catching pieces of it. And the more you allow these systems to grow and to build, they become self-defensive. Records get cut off, information disappears, reporters get harassed, organizations get sued. We have 42 lawsuits against our network right now. OCCRP has 6 lawsuits in 4 countries against us. And organizations all over the world are seeing this. These are powerful interests with a lot of money who can fight back aggressively. And they have people in law enforcement, and they have people in the courts, and they have people at every level. And we see, in the work that we do, ridiculous decisions that are made. And it's often because there is somebody who's associated with the criminal gang that we're looking at, undermining something that we're doing. So I can only say that it's getting a lot tougher from when I started this, 15 years ago to now. I would say it's about 10 times more difficult. And investigative reporting in itself is incredibly difficult, with the offshore structures that we have to deal with. So to actually have to, fend off, your sources being murdered and all these types of problems, is making it difficult, and it's making it difficult to keep good people But fortunately, there's a lot of really heroic people, some of who you will see if you see Tony Blinken next, including somebody from our network, who just keep at it and keep doing this amazing work.
Thanks. I'm going to sort of take advantage of having Drew and Myra, the last speakers here, and give you a joint question. So you're both involved in the GAC, and again, this model is unique because it seeks to break down the barriers between journalists and civil society. And I imagine that when you started the GAC in 2016, there were challenges. So could both of you speak to some of those challenges and how you overcame them, and any lessons learned for other journalists and advocates who might be attempting this model?
Sure. So this is not easy. You know, when we started GAC, we knew it would be difficult, but you know, the first thing, investigative reporting and the nature of the business requires you to really trust people. You know, our network is built solidly on trust, and to bring an outsider, an activist no less, you know, into that network and say, you know, we're going to share information with them, you know, was, you know, not even popular with some of our reporters. But we're working in places around the world that the rules have changed. The fundamental ground has shifted, and we need to do things differently. And so it took a long time to build up the trust in the people, I think both ways. And we had to understand how the other person's culture was and how it worked. In journalism, we have really strict ethical rules on you know, how we handle things like, you know, talking to sources or talking to activists. And we did not want TI to be, you know, pushing their activism within OCCRP. We didn't want it to touch our stories. And you know, so we set up some rules, and they're difficult rules to maintain, and you have to train everybody that comes in. But once it works incredibly well. And now I have just the greatest respect in the world for Myra and her team. They are truly amazing people. And an assessment that we did afterwards showed that it's 5 times more effective at getting impact when you work together than when you don't work together. And that's a stunning number, 5 times. That's a stunning number. And in places, you know, like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Russia and places like that, those are the places that change comes so hard that this is really an incredibly effective tool at leveraging open and making some change. So now our reporters are really behind it, and you know, we have to keep people reminded of the rules, and it's I would not suggest this for every organization out there, you know, but for the right organization with the right partner, it's an amazing tool.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe I added some of the challenge from our side, because we are an anti-corruption organization. We have a movement based in 100 countries, and our chapters vary quite a lot. And the way they approach anti-corruption is also very different. And working with cases and working with legal accountability and being parties in case is also something relatively new to our movement. So this partnership also meant that we had to adjust and put our house in order to be able to work on this. And then we had to step up our security, we had to step up our legal insurance and making sure that we would be protecting our partners, that would be engaging more closely with cases. So I think it also for us meant a little bit more of adjustment, but I would just emphasize that it's amazing to have this really rich amount of information coming from these investigations that are useful for legal accountability, which we just discussed, but also very useful to change the systemic issues, which is really important, no? If we want to see not the same things happening and repeating themselves all over again. So I think it's definitely made us a lot more stronger and put us in a much better position to fight for better rules, better institutions, and more accountability.
And it doesn't mean we agree on everything. I mean, yeah. We still can't convince TI that organized crime is corruption, but you know, it's disagreements that are principled, and we have good discussions on.
I feel like those lessons on learning the other side's culture might be valuable within the U.S. government as well, but that's another story entirely. So my next question is really for all four panelists. So effective responses to transnational corruption require global networks and cooperation. And given the cross-border nature of corruption, how do each of you and your organizations or former organizations work with peers in other countries? And can I start with Stephen on this one?
Sure. A lot of different ways, I would say. There is your straight up collaboration where you just sign these memorandums of understanding and you can share content. There are situations in which you can share resources and do investigations together, long-form investigations. These mostly, in our case, happen with other journalistic organizations. There are situations in which some organizations are better than others in certain aspects. Drew's organization is excellent at gathering those gazillion terabytes and organizing them for people like us who don't have the wherewithal or time to do it, and then sharing that with us. That's incredibly valuable. And putting together a network of different organizations to share that type of information. So that's a way to collaborate as well. So there's a plethora of ways to cut across these spaces. In our case, we also cut across disciplines. We work with academics, we work with policy think tanks. We don't work directly with, I don't know, I kind of hate the term activists, but, and we don't consider ourselves activists. In fact, when we interact with governments, even, we don't, our goal is not for them to, we don't sit around and say, oh yeah, we want you to open up an investigation on X or Y. We actually tell them from the onset that what we're looking for is patterns. Because the patterns we see today, they may still exist. Most likely they don't. We're not trying to help you see the criminals of today, but to be able to see the criminals of tomorrow. And how do you do that? You see the patterns. You see the nodes where these things operate. You see how they operate, the modus operandi. And then the next time you see it, you go, oh yeah, I know how this works. And you know exactly where to look. Or you know where to put your resources. And that's maybe more important in a situation in which you have limited resources to put towards these questions. So that's kind of what we're after. Less about being a kind of extension of law enforcement and more about being something that'll help them understand it over the long term.
I laugh because former law enforcement, we saw you as an extension of law enforcement. No, the cases that the FBI gets when it deals with international corruption are often multi-billion-dollar cases. When I retired from the FBI, I had at least 10 investigations open for countries that were missing in excess, somewhere between $1 to $40 billion. And so one of the things we found out is, like after Arab Spring, the world got together and hosted the Arab Forum on Asset Recovery. And so countries from all over the world got together and they said, hey, we have money from Egypt in this bank account. Switzerland came forward and said, we have money from here. In 2014, when President Yanukovych fled Ukraine, while he was president, approximately $40 billion left Ukraine. So the world got together in the UK and hosted the UFAR, the Ukrainian Forum on Asset Recovery. And again, there's people all over the world saying, okay, some of the money moved through Estonia. No, it moved through Austria or Liechtenstein. And we started tracing the money. But it's people from all over the world coming together and sharing their bit of the puzzle. There's since been a global forum on asset recovery. But when you're looking at money moving billions of dollars, no one country could do it individually. When $5 billion left Malaysia in the one MDB case, the United States was very fortunate to be able to help Malaysia recover at least $1.8 billion thus far of the stolen money. But the money wasn't in the, some of the money was in the United States, but most of it wasn't. While working for the FBI, I seized more than $1 billion from foreign corrupt leaders. None of it was in the United States. It was all in foreign banks. The United States had venue. So other countries who don't have great civil forfeiture law, who couldn't go after or had no ability or knowledge or background in tracing money internationally. And so thank God for mutual legal assistance. Thank God for 180 signers on the UN Convention Against Corruption. Because if there isn't an MLAT treaty available, you're probably a signer on UNCAC, which means there's another treaty obligation to provide bank records and other records to do witness interviews. So these large international cases, one of the very first things somebody does when they loot their state coffers is they move the money out of their country. And so you're going to need international cooperation to locate it, find out what form does it have now. Is it a yacht? Is it an aircraft? Is it a villa? Is it a bank account, investment? Where is it sitting today? Whose name, what nominees are hiding those funds or assets? And then who has the best venue? You look at Obiang out of Equatorial Guinea. France did an excellent job going after Teodoro Obiang's assets, vehicles, aircraft, 2 properties. The United States also had venues, so the U.S. also seized several $1 million worth of Obiang's. But you know you're not going to get any assistance out of Equatorial Guinea. So it is an international effort to fight corruption. I'm all about following the money. My motto is carpe omnia, seize it all. So we couldn't do that without international cooperation.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think we at Transparency International are in a quite privileged position because we have people on the ground in more than 100 countries. And the way we partner with them and with others vary quite a lot. So I want to give one concrete example that I think shows the different things we're trying to do. So following an investigation by OCCRP involving people in the Gambia, what we did is we engaged with local community there. We helped them preparing a participatory video that would give voice to the victims of corruption. This helped people in the country understand what was going on in the middle of a period where they were in a transition period with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been created and so on. And this empowered people to speak up and to actually participate in that process. What we also did in parallel to that is we took the evidence that was coming from that investigation, which included also real estate property in the US. We prepared the package and we submitted to authorities in the US. It led actually to the confiscation of this property after a while. And now we continue to engage with these organizations at the local level, supporting them in efforts for recovering the assets and having these assets repatriated. So this is one example that you go from trying to engage with the local community, empower them to understand and improve their laws and legislations, their systems, and then also trying to find jurisdiction elsewhere to get some accountability. And in other cases, we have been engaging in different ways. Another thing is golden visas. We have been working on this. It's basically, in Europe, many countries have a program that you can get either residence or citizenship in exchange for an investment. And this is something also that thanks to investigations by journalists, it reached quite the media and helped change the narrative because it was always portrayed as something not that bad. It's just an opportunity there. And now we reached the stage that the European Commission is keen to change in the rules, have been studying how to do that. Malta and Cyprus there is infringement procedure against those countries open, and this is thanks to this type of work that we are able to do because we have people on the ground that can collect the information that you need and bring it up to a higher level as well.
So I think, the first thing is, I think, globalize. About 30 years ago, organized crime globalized very effectively, and they used the enabler industry and offshore registration agents and London lawyers and American hedge funds to build a massive global presence, and we didn't see that. And they made most of their money not actually from stealing it, from Russia and other countries. They made it by putting in American hedge funds and help driving a massive increase in stock prices. So, it's organized crime in Google stock that really has empowered organized crime more than anything. And so consequently, organized crime globalized, built a network, used the best lawyers and everything to build this incredibly successful structure. And, you have to embrace doing that yourself, Like TI, OCCRP is now global. We're actually the first ever global investigative reporting organization. We're in over 60 countries. We have editors, more than 50 editors on 6 continents. And we have to go to the places that organized crime is. So we've got, editors in Palau and distant places, because that's where you need to find the information. And then you have to trust your local partners. You work on agreeing on standards and everything, but it is about local skills and knowledge. And that's sometimes hard for you to understand why they're good or why they do things the way they do. But in the end, if you don't trust them, you will not succeed. And so you have to have the patience and understand that you're probably wrong half the time. And so don't be judgmental and work to understand them as much as possible. Then it's hard work. I mean, it really is hard work building these kind of relationships up, relationships of trust, relationships of communication, understanding, and you have to put in that kind of work. And then, you have to embrace new models. OCCRP is unique. We're not a competitive news organization. Our values are not based on making money, it's based on having impact. And that's a completely different way of looking at the world if you're a journalism organization. And so we see ourselves as the ecosphere for collaborative cross-border reporting. And we work with anybody, who demonstrates that they're, interested in doing this work and can contribute. And we don't try to compete with them. We don't try to take too much credit for things. And we try to work with them. And we give them all of our resources and tools, so all of our expertise, so that a small investigative reporting organization can join something like OCCRP and suddenly have off the shelf the best data experts in the world, the best research team in the world, the best safety people in the world, the best fundraising people in the world. And so that small center can be empowered to be 20 times more effective than it is. So if you embrace these new models and change the value system, you can be far more effective. And then finally, you need to accept that your adversary is not staying still. Organized crime and corrupt people are audacious. They are truly audacious people, and they have incredible ideas. And right now, you can see Russia and China and Iran and Syria and other countries, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, are all teaming up to create a counterbalance to the sanctioning, organizations of the West, so that they can bypass these things and effectively, do what they want to do, which is state capture and criminality, and undermining, democracy around the world. And so, you have to constantly, this is a arms race that's gonna go on forever. And, if you want democracy to survive, you have to fight the battle.
Sobering thought. So again, a question for all 4. What are the most significant barriers that you have seen to civil society participation in efforts to counter corruption that you've seen based on your different roles and positions? And what do you or your organization most need to more effectively participate in counter-corruption efforts? Let's start with Deb on this one.
It's interesting because coming from a law enforcement standpoint and now being on the side where I work for an NGO, when I was at the Global Forum on Asset Recovery, civil society was unfortunately treated as the children sitting at the kids' table at Thanksgiving. When we met like in a separate room, and we were civil society talking to civil society when we needed to be talking to other people. That was already years ago, so I hope it's better. But I remember how frustrated we were with not being able to share our message outside of civil society. We just were not given the opportunity to be at that forum to be briefing law enforcement and other people. So that was frustrating. And I will say things are changing, which is great, because when I was with the Bureau, we weren't allowed to talk to journalists at all. Under Director Louis Freeh, no comment was a comment. And so if I were at an event like this, and I'm like, oh, hi, I'm Debra LaPrevotte, and they're like, hi, I'm with Reuters, I'd be backing up. I was like, I can't talk to you. I just talked to you, And so now we welcome, even though it's a one-way conversation, talking to NGOs, civil society, and investigative journalists, because you're filling a gap on information in that law enforcement can't be everywhere. So I think it's getting better, but I think the big stumbling blocks for me were that there's still, law enforcement has they're wary of speaking to civil society, and as I said, I think it's changing, but until recently, there's been more of a barrier than there is now.
Any other takers?
Yeah, I think related to that, I will start with something related that is, I would call distorted access to policy and decision makers. And this is at all levels. It's related to what you were saying. If you are at the global level, until very recently, for example, the Financial Action Task Force, that is the global standard setter on anti-money laundering, which is crucial for us here if we're talking about following the money, for example, held a private sector consultative forum, but didn't have any means of engaging with civil society. Now we can participate in that, but it's very, very recent. That's the same at the UN. You go to UNCAC meetings, sometimes civil society are blocked from even attending and traveling to the country where a conference of states parties are happening. And then at the domestic level, you face this on a daily basis, no? Restricted space for civil society to participate, for citizens to participate. The Big Four can call a meeting and the whole finance ministry will attend, and you organize a session, you cannot even get a speaker from a ministry. So the level of access it's completely different, with just starts policy-making, decision-making, and so on. Another critical issue is related to access to information, because we cannot fight corruption, we cannot prevent corruption without having access to information, and that's one of the things that we at TI have been fighting for, from access to information laws to more proactive transparency. Beneficial ownership registers, for example, is one of the things we have been fighting for, and we just had a big blow 2 weeks ago when the European Court of Justice decided to shut down access to beneficial ownership registers, something we had been fighting for at the EU level for 10 years or so. And lastly, I think, is the shrinking space for civil society, which is reflected on digital threats, physical threats, and legal threats. Drew mentioned lawsuits that his network is facing. We also have some of our members facing lawsuits at the moment. We have our colleague from Russia in a difficult situation at the moment. We have our colleague from Madagascar facing currently a lawsuit thanks to a submission that we made jointly to law enforcement. Immediate reaction was she had to face the court, and so on. So those, I think, are the key barriers that are affecting our ability to fight corruption.
I would just say two things. One is reiterating what Drew said earlier about force multipliers. Force multipliers in terms of collecting information. So obviously you have partners, you have different people you can work with that can really help you in the space of, like, when we have worked closely with NGOs in collecting information, some of whom, for example, were observing elections, for example. And they have a far vaster staff, and they're covering spaces that we're not, so we can go to them and we can talk to them thereafter. So that was kind of a force multiplier. And then in dissemination. So the same different people that you're working with, getting it out through different channels. Of course, there's sort of, we all think of, dissemination in terms of social media and stuff like that, but there are different ways of disseminating, as I was talking about before. You can disseminate outward, or you can have these kind of closed door stuff. Then the second major thing, I think, is what we try and focus on is changing the narrative. Not thinking so much in terms of, like, you know, oh, this story is going to have this huge impact. But how many different stories are we writing about this topic, this theme that we're covering? And these themes are very often corruption related. But thinking about it in those terms, it's a marathon, is what we try and tell ourselves. It's not a sprint. Because if you think of it as just a sprint, oh, this story is going to have this impact, and then this is going to change, and then, no, I don't think it really works like this. I think we need to change the way that we look at this, and that for us is changing the narrative. And I'll give you just one example of our efforts in that regard, which is that we started a whole campaign about talking about elites and organized crime. Because so much of the way in which we talked about crime before was from the bottom up. So it was like, oh, what are the gangs doing? What are the drug trafficking groups doing? And then all of the resources are geared towards dealing with that issue. That's the easy political victory for most politicians in most spaces. But what if we turned that on its head and started talking about it from the top down and just constantly beating that drum, talking about it from the top down? And that for us was changing the narrative.
And just one, and you know, this is kind of obvious and it's self-serving maybe, but money. I mean, when it comes right down to it, you know, journalism is viewed, you know, as a commercial, you know, enterprise, and it really isn't anymore. It's actually a public service. And we as societies need to think about how we protect this public service, because, you know, the business models that were out there are dead. And if you look at, you know, Hungary and Russia, you know, Hungary has put already about $1 billion into its media. Russia puts billions of dollars a year into their media. Now, Russia is an incredibly cheap country. You know, their bribes are really small. You'd be surprised how small Russian bribes are. And, you know, but they spend billions of dollars on media, because they understand its value, and they understand, you know, that this is what defines them, and this is what, propagates their propaganda. And yet the West spends 2% of its total development assistance on media, and of that, only 5% of that 2% is on investigative reporting. And so consequently, you know, while they're spending billions, we're spending millions. And it shows. It shows in propaganda. It shows in a lot of things. You know, there shouldn't be one OCCRP. There should be 10 of us. You know, you should be inundated with investigative reporting. There should be money to invest in new ideas and reaching younger people, in creating creative new ways to get information to people. You know, in the old days, journalism, you lived in a town, you got an event-driven daily newspaper, but you had the context. You knew your town. So those little event-driven things that you got in the newspaper, you understood. We don't understand the context anymore. The world is way too complex, and that's why propaganda works. And so consequently, we have to reinvent investigative reporting and reinvent journalism. And we're trying to do that, but we're trying to do it on really very little money. And so, I mean, I think I'm not saying, you know, donors give us more money. Well, I am kind of saying that. But what I'm saying is we as a society need to say, how do we make sure that we get our information needs fulfilled? And it's not working now, and we need to figure out a way to do that.
Okay, I've got another one for all four. So what are some of the specific actions that you would recommend governments take to improve the environment for civil society organization or non-governmental partners pushing for anti-corruption focused reforms? Apart from money, Drew, would you like to start?
I'll make it simple. Transparency. You know, we're going to be rebuilding Ukraine with $100 billion, and most of the foreign organizations in there are not going to make any of that information available as to how that money is being spent, and it'll be a disaster, and tens of billions of dollars will be stolen because they don't want civil society looking in what they're doing. So transparency, transparency, transparency.
Well, I would, I agree, 100%. I would say radical and proactive transparency. We want more information rather than less information. We always say that everywhere we have people collecting data to make decisions, right? It's just in the public administration that we're not making use of the data to be able to detect crime, to more proactive find leads and so on. So we need to collect more information, and we need to make as much as possible available to other people to be able to use as well.
I think that civil society and investigative journalists are putting out so much stuff, but I can tell you, like, I've worked corruption for 27 years, and I can talk to close friends of mine, and they have no idea what's going on anywhere else in the world. So maybe, you know, I don't know, how do we come up with an innovative way to show what's going on in the rest of the world? I worked South Sudan, and I could, you know, and I worked Bangladesh, and if I asked half of my friends, like, without looking on a map, you know, where is South Sudan, and they wouldn't know. And so it's like, how do we get the information out? And then somebody else would be on my investigations, Debbie, you work South Sudan, like, how am I going to make a woman in Ohio care about South Sudan? You know, she doesn't know where it is, she's never going to go there. And I said, because you have to show the links, right? I mean, okay, well, the United States gave, you know, $97 million in aid to South Sudan. This is your tax money, so you should kind of know where it's going and what it's doing. And so bring it home and make people understand how the corruption, I mean, having worked Ukraine under Yanukovych and Tymoshenko, I tell people, like, $40 billion, I said it is the financial rape of a country by Russia of Ukraine, because Yanukovych was Putin's man. And I said that made the military so weak that it was easy for Russia to invade and then annex, or I say steal, Crimea. I landed on the ground and I'm like, hi, I'm Debra LaPrevotte, I'm with the FBI. And they're like, could you come back, we're being invaded? And I was like, yeah, you know, it's like, we're here to help. So I just think there's some way we need to figure out, how do we get people to understand the level of international corruption, the trillions of dollars moving through financial systems, it impacts you, right? And that would be a major step.
Yeah, just what Drew said earlier, the sustained support, especially for local partners that work with organizations like ourselves. And what you see often is you'll get a lot of government funding, and the funding will go to, for example, you know, workshop, and the workshop will, it's great to have a workshop over the weekend or something like that. That's fine. I've participated in those myself, but what we've seen work in terms of government interaction with investigators, whether they're NGOs or journalists, is if you have something that is sustained and includes final products for those works. So you don't do a workshop, you do a 6-month mentorship program with different organizations that can mentor, in some cases, local groups or journalists that are doing these types of investigations, because sometimes they're difficult and they don't have the experience to do it, and they don't have the wherewithal to keep themselves safe. And that is a much more sustainable model to building out your sort of army of investigators that you need over the long haul. So don't do your weekender workshops, do your 6-month to a year mentorships.
I wonder if you folks could talk a little bit about what type of coordination you'd like to see with and among governments that's currently not happening in this space. Anyone?
Well, I mean, you know, there is some cooperation amongst governments. I mean, you know, in the Summit for Democracy, the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium was one of the deliverables by the U.S. government. And, you know, there's been a number of governments that have joined. Slovakia announced today that they were going to join the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium. So I think there's been some really creative work on the part of the government to try to get more governments involved. I think there's a lot of work that has to be done, you know, globally in all governments looking at this issue of corruption. It really has been that, you know, politicians think they can speak against it and not invest in it, and that's the problem, you know. I think, law enforcement is woefully, and prosecutors are woefully underfunded in governments across the world. If you look at the, Olaf and all the EU, those are underfunded. I think that there needs to be a general discussion on governments, on how the 4 pillars of fighting corruption, which is, exposure through journalists, activism, law enforcement, and policy changes that really make it difficult to be corrupt. And these discussions are probably not going on to the extent that they need to. But, there is progress on it, and it is good that, there has been investment by multiple governments, at least on the Global Anti-Corruption Consortium. And so I think progress is being made, but a lot of work still needs to be done.
Just, we talked a little bit already about the challenges in international cooperation, and I think the war now in Ukraine exacerbated the need, for exchanging information and doing it in a faster way. So I think the efforts that have started now with the Transatlantic Task Force, for example, the REPO Task Force, is something that we would like to see governments expanding, broadening the scope, so not only Russia, there's cross-border corruption there that needs to be tackled in an effective manner. So I think this could be a potential way of governments cooperating better together, creating mechanisms for more easily share intelligence and information so that we can prosecute crimes and hold those to account.
I think I take it from a UN standpoint. I love the UN Convention Against Corruption, but I'd like it to have more teeth. And by this, I mean, obviously I work South Sudan. Several of our South Sudanese generals have been sanctioned for war crimes and atrocities by the UN, and yet they still own property in Kenya and Uganda. And there should be, as a signer on UNCAC, there should have been an asset freeze. That didn't happen. The banks in those areas did close the accounts after giving them 2 weeks to close their account, take all the money from their accounts. One of our generals recently traveled to China, who had been sanctioned to attend a war expo. And so, sanctions are great, but if they're not followed or enforced, then they're weak. So I just like to see that there's some punitive action for those countries who are signers who basically ignore the treaty when they want to.
I guess what I've seen work is informal interactions between different nationalities and governments. They have a training session, then they have a cookout, and they drink a bunch of beers, and they hang out. And then thereafter, they establish a personal connection, and then they start exchanging information. So we're not talking about high-level stuff. And even when the high-level stuff breaks down, the mid to low-level guys keep communicating. That's what I've seen work, is after you get them in these spaces where they can develop these relationships, and then thereafter, they can communicate. And then that has led to a lot of cross-border cooperation.
So I want to thank you all for the great answers that you've all provided here, but I want to give a chance for folks in the audience to ask some questions. And, oh, there's a hand up.
Yeah, will do. Thank you. Very interesting. My name's Jonathan Lyles. I actually represent His Majesty's Revenue and Customs in the UK. I'm actually based in DC as an attaché here. And I'm a fiscal crime liaison officer and all that entails. And Deborah, a lot that you said resonates very clearly with me, including sometimes a reluctance or reticence or just being unable to speak with journalists. But I'd welcome your views on how you feel like government agencies can actually integrate and better communicate with each other. Because I find sometimes I take the view, dare to share, and as long as I'm within the remit legally in order to do so, that's fine. But I find quite often with certain governments and government agencies across the globe that reciprocity just isn't there, and sometimes it's like knocking your head against a brick wall, and that's from someone who's working in that environment. So I guess part of my reason for being here today is I want to engage with the conversations with like-minded folk, and if people got anything to bring to my attention from a UK nexus, yes, I know there was an pool employed to get some information, but that's what I'm here for. But I'd welcome any views on what you think governments can do together to better share information, because sometimes that is just as difficult as well.
It goes back to what you were just saying about building relationships. I worked very well with both the Scotland Yard and the National Crime Agency in the UK, and it's because many people that are looting assets either buy property in the UK and they have bank accounts in the United States. So we had mutual interests, and it was building trust, but the real cooperation was investigator to investigator. I was fortunate enough to be in another country once where it was going to take us a year through the mutual legal assistance process to get records. So while I was sitting in this investigator's office, he said, I really can't share this information with you, but I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. And he left for 15 minutes so that I could rifle through his material. So I don't know how we, I think the best thing we could do is, and it's funding, is how do you speed up the mutual legal assistance process so that countries can share more quickly. Coming up, I know it's been pitched for years, having an electronic way to share internationally quickly, as opposed to printing 1,000-page documents, having them signed off by the Crown. It goes from the Ministry of Justice to our Ministry, to our Ministry of Justice, and that could be a year process. Even in the United States, if I want to send you a request, it may be 6 to 8 months before my request leaves the United States to get to the Ministry of Justice. So I think coming up with, in this day and age, a better way, a faster way to share electronically so that it's not a year process to get bank records out of another country. It's several months. And yeah, I think that's it.
Hi there, I'm Nicole Bird from the network. So there's been a lot of talk about sharing between governments and journalists and advocacy organizations, and what I haven't really heard a lot yet here is the tech sector. And I think some of this speaks a little bit to Deb's point about making things faster and more efficient. So I just wonder, given that just part of the cost and lengthiness of investigations connecting people to other people, especially across borders, or people to assets, is the manual nature, right? That feeds into the expense and the time-consumingness. So I'd love to know what you guys think about, say, applications for tech partners and machine learning to connect the dots in certain cases. Where going into 2023 might that lead?
So I mean, from the journalism standpoint, that's already well on its way. OCCRP runs a software package which is open source and available to everybody on Earth called Aleph. And Aleph is essentially a poor man's Palantir, and it allows you to match data across any number of databases. It extracts all the entities out of a file, does an optical character recognition, and then matches those entities up together, and then does some disambiguation of them. And so consequently, you can put 100 databases in and then match all those databases at once. So, journalists were cheap. We try to figure out the fastest way to do some of these things, and we've got over 4 billion criminal entities in there now. And journalists use it every day, and they keep adding more and more data. And every leak we get, we pile it in there, and it becomes, this, mega intelligence tool. So, we can do that because, we have leaks. The police side of things. Police say, they just to get how many inches in a foot, they'll subpoena somebody. It's traditionally been that. But journalists, because we have none of that subpoena power and none of that, we have to do everything kind of on the cheap. And so, that works. It's harder when you talk, governments can't do that. You know, they can't share databases amongst each other, but they should. Because if you did allow, if we built a, you know, you could get rid of crime tomorrow if somebody took all of the bank records from all over the world and put them in one database, and crime would disappear. You know, because you can track everything. You know, people wouldn't like it, but, you know, maybe it would be worth it to get rid of crime. So tech is part of the solution, but it's just, you know, incredibly difficult for people other than journalists and activists to move down that route.
Maybe quickly just to add, because I think there are some efforts, particularly at the EU level, where you have a lot of member states that have to comply with the same directive to try to interconnect data more easily. So for example, every single member state of the EU needs to have a bank account register which contains beneficial ownership information. And now there is an effort to interconnect those bank account registers in a single entry point, which will be accessible to law enforcement and hopefully financial intelligence units as well. And this would be very useful. There is also efforts to interconnect beneficial ownership register, so one single point of access to authorities in the EU. But one point to what you're saying, I think we also need to get smarter on what can be made publicly available. So we don't need to mobilize a whole international cooperation request for something that could be easily consulted by authorities. I was seeing report, mutual evaluation report from, I think, Bahamas, where they have a beneficial ownership register that is not available to the public and not directly available to authorities. So it means that this register is there, they spend money creating this register, but authorities still need to request and has a whole process to request, and they still take 60 days to get information of something that is there. It could be easily made available. So I think we also need to get smarter of not having to mobilize a whole 3-4 agencies in the government to something that could be available with one click for people sitting anywhere in the world.
My question is a little bit complex, but at this point I'm looking for just a simple response. So my name is Samah Salman. I'm from Sudan. I work in the private sector, but I'm part of an advocacy working group that's looking at some of the kleptocracy in Sudan. So there's a concept of blood gold, which is gold that where you have a deal that's been cut by one of our biggest militia leaders, who's the #2 man, general, autocrat in Sudan right now, General Hamdan Dagalo Hameti, and Prigozhin, who is Putin's right-hand man, his chef, and one of the biggest oligarchs, to smuggle gold, basically load onto planes through the UAE to Russia. This gold is basically being stolen from Sudanese citizens and some of the most marginalized groups, also at the moment used to fuel the war in, partially to fuel the war in Ukraine. My question is, when you have such a complicated and sophisticated network, we've been trying to advocate for targeted sanctions against these autocrats in Sudan, and we've been actively doing that with the US government. So you've got the supply, you've got intermediaries, and you've got the demand. How do you, where can you work? What is the most effective strategy? Is it you hit the supply, you hit the demand, which is targeted sanctions against the Russians, or is it the intermediaries? Or is it about the political climate and who's most willing to help in that network? If you could just comment.
So basically, like trying to get the intermediaries, the supply chain, the people that are trafficking the gold. It's difficult, right? Because what you're looking at are people that have smaller amounts of money, so it's hard to go after them. Yeah, I mean, we're working the same investigations from the South Sudan side, right? And so targeted sanctions help, but it's hard to get people who are sanctioning people to go after smaller people. And then even the targeted sanctions, so you sanction them, but they're not in like the US financial system. So the US sanctions, the UN sanctioned one of our South Sudanese warlords, moderate, and his response to the UN sanction was, are they going to take my cows? And they're like, well, no. He goes, then what do I care? You know, I don't bank. And I think targeting, like, then I would find, how do you hurt them? Take their aircraft. I mean, if it's being flown out of Sudan, how is it moving? What company owns the aircraft? And go after the corporate entities that are acting as enablers to move the gold out. While you sanction targeted, like you said, a network sanction, going after those people within that network. But again, it's like, where are they hitting the financial system? And are you making sure that you're targeting the right people to have any type of impact? It's obviously difficult because we're doing the same thing, and it's interesting. One of the successes, though, in Entebbe, they have the African gold refinery, and it's refining gold for everybody in parts of Africa. And while I was looking at Congo gold going into African gold refinery, I looked down and I'm like, well, this is coming from Aruba, and it was Venezuelan gold. So, I got that information into the hands of people looking at Venezuela. I'm like, you want to find money for Maduro? Look at this gold refinery. But Alan Getz, who owns Getz Gold and owns the African gold refinery, he's been sanctioned by the U.S. and I think by the EU. So look at people within that supply chain that can be targeted, and then is there the ability to go after them by seizing their aircraft, seizing their boats, and seizing the facilitation devices that are enabling the gold?
And in the end, you have to look at these ongoing enabling environments that have been set up. The souks in UAE and Dubai have been, handling gold for so many dirty people. That's where a lot of the Swiss gold, it's repurposed as Swiss gold, and so, this is, there is a way to say, hey, we're going to sanction you as a country. In politics, it's always very difficult because there's so many political interests, but at a certain point, in the old days, they used to have, these runway banks in the Caribbean where you'd fly in with your plane, you'd, taxi down to the end, you'd open the door, you'd throw out bags of cash, and then you'd take off, And they eventually got rid of them, and, it takes kind of international pressure to say, we're not tolerating this anymore, and we're not going to accept, Dubai gold, from the souks anymore, and you have to do something about it, and that's just not really being done anymore. I mean, everybody wants to create the next Dubai. Everybody wants to create another environment because we're allowing this to happen. Countries have allowed, these bad actors to do these things. And at some point, we just have to say no more.
In the back there.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Blair Glencourse from Accountability Lab. We've talked a bit about the nefarious networks, the way the bad guys protect each other, sustain each other. Flipping the narrative a little bit, do you have any new ideas or have you heard anything at this conference that helps you think a bit more about how to support networks of good guys? Obviously, to some extent, that's what OCCRP is doing, for example, with investigative journalists. The US government just announced its new anti-corruption champions today. There's OGP has networks of reformers that are coming together. But how else can we build these networks of good guys to come together, to share ideas, to push creatively for new approaches to this kind of thing, which is, of course, a big part of what needs to happen?
That's a good question. I mean, it's a great question. And, I see across the world there are so many new kind of ideas. This is really social innovation that we need here. The social innovation is as important as anything. And, OCCRP was built kind of out of a very specific need. We actually started OCCRP so we could buy LexisNexis between two different organizations, and that grew into what we were. It was basically an organic development. And, I think that, there's a lot of way to fund innovation in the space, and I think a lot of organizations do that. But, the problem is you do something interesting, you get a couple $100,000, and then if it takes you 5 years to get to the next level, it's difficult. I think there needs to be more creativity in the part of donors to say, hey, this idea is working, let's blow it up big. OCCRP, people think of it as a success, but we're a success of 15 years of hard work, starting every year, increasing by 20%, from nothing. Sure, it would have been nice. I don't know that we were smart enough to be able to, after 5 years to be what we are now. I think I needed 15 years to be smart enough to figure it out. But there are people who can figure it out in 5 years. And you got to take successful programs and you got to throw money at them, and be more innovative in how you're doing it. And you're looking for social innovation, and you're looking for people who are building networks and who are building ideas and spaces. The new Institute for the Future, that I spent some time at, talks a lot about, what the new environments are to work in. And really it is creating ecospheres where people can communicate and cooperate, built around values that are very different than traditional organizational values. And I think you look for those types of things, and when you find one that's good, you boost it.
Yeah, I think, a lot of the work we do, it's very hard to measure. And a lot of the barometers that are put on us in terms of measuring our success, I think are ridiculous. And they put us in difficult spots. And, frankly, there's a lot of organizations that deal with that. The question of impact and accountability is important. It's always going to be important for funders. We understand that. But it's gone to the extreme now where you feel like you're suffocating. And if you're trying to do something like, if you're on a marathon trying to change the narrative, I think there are some organizations that fund these sorts of things that understand that. But there's a lot more that don't. So you're on these sort of, cyclical funding cycles. You're sort of constantly scratching and clawing for money, and you don't get any chance to do any work, and do what Drew's saying, sort of the evolution or development or maturity that comes with. We're a little bit younger than they are. We're 12 years old, but that comes with that time, and money and space in order to think and do that. But most of the way that the system is organized to support organizations like ours is not geared for that. You have to make your own time to figure out how you're going to last for 12 or 15 years. And that scramble is never ending. And until you kind of change your perception and give people that space and ability to mature and get better at this and be able to develop, the partnerships and networks that you need in order to, push back or at least mitigate some of these very bad things that are happening on the planet, then it's just going to continue in this cycle. So, I think that's, from my perspective, that's kind of the frustrating thing that I see, and hopefully that can change.
Yeah, and just one additional point. I was talking to a donor, and we were talking about a particular country, and there's 50 independent news organizations and associated organizations in that country, and they were funding all 50 of them, at a fairly low level. And so nobody fails. So we are, we have tons of zombie organizations in our businesses. These are organizations that are too good to fail and not good enough to succeed. And that I think you got to let some organizations die. I think you got to really kind of weed out the weak. That sounds harsh, I know, but there are plenty of organizations out there that I know of that if they had a lot of money, they would be doing far more impactful things than they're doing now. And they don't get it because there's so much money going to organizations that are just kind of surviving and muddling through. So, I mean, it's a really difficult thing to be a donor, extremely difficult to do it well. And I think that donors have to develop themselves, and they have to really spend a lot more time figuring out how to do this effectively, because I think, a lot of them are not doing it. There are some that are incredible, but the others that are really, really making the situation actually worse.
Maybe one more.
Final question?
Thank you so much. Mahatma Balditi Institute. I would love just to echo on the point of the organizations like too vulnerable to succeed and very willing to fail. So I would love just to elaborate more if donors like the Department of State, the RL Bureau, or any other donors, what kind of mechanisms that they can take to make sure that there is kind of effective, not inclusion, but fair distribution of fund at field level to make sure that some dominant organizations are not seizing the scene, and also to make sure that there is a kind of sustainability for the sector of nonprofit organizations who are working to support anti-corruption or any kind of interventions related to corruption. Thank you.
Wow. I don't know if I understood your question well. Like as to accountability and funding, I mean, everybody, when I go around the world and I try to train investigators, we all suffer from the same thing. We don't have enough people, we don't have enough time, and we don't have enough money. But I think the next thing, so accountability and goes hand in hand in that. How do you have accountability? I think the investigative journalists like the OCCRP, ICIJ, and others, I mean, that's where accountability comes in because it's exposing high-level political corruption and corruption. I have like no suggestions on like how to get that funded because everybody's fighting for the few dollars that are out there. Like you just said, a lot of people are funding a lot of people, and some people, the more money going to some successful outlets would be better, but I don't think I'm addressing her question correctly.
So since you talked specifically about the Department of State, you know, to Drew's point, I think it is something that we are continuously learning, and I think the approaches that we are taking now are different from how we have approached things in the past, and I certainly hope, you know, a decade from now we will still be learning and adapting. I do have to say, for an entity like the State Department, our funding moves slowly. We are trying to move more to try to make sure that more money is reaching the groups on the ground with the local contextual knowledge and also as a means of building capacity on the ground. But that's also a long and slow process that involves all of the oversight requirements that we have. So we are trying to do better. We are trying to make sure that we are seeding the right locations, but I suspect it's still not feeling very satisfying to the people who are at the end of that chain.
I do think that, you know, one mistake that donors sometimes make is they don't graduate programs into that kind of funding, the direct funding. And I'm a strong believer that a lot more money should go directly to organizations in country and not through implementers. You know, implementers are a very expensive way, you know, to do foreign assistance. And there's a time and a place where they're absolutely necessary and they're appropriate to use, but I don't think we transition fast enough into direct assistance to organizations. You know, I know organizations who have to sit there and accept trainings after trainings after trainings of people that can't really help them because they don't want to piss off the donor, you know, and they deal with these things when really you're taking time away from them doing investigative reporting or other things. So, you know, you should first do no harm, and that's more of a problem with the implementers than it really is with the donors. And this is a tough business, and it's, you know, mistakes always get made. And for the most part, I think, you know, most donors, I just talk with donors and I tell them exactly how I feel and what I need and what I think I need, and they either agree with me or they don't. But I tend to have really good conversations with them, and I can't complain about too many of them except for one in particular, which I will mention. But, you know, you know, I think people have to do that more. They have to be more direct, and you know, donors are smart people, and in the end, it's always worked out for us. but it takes being proactive with donors and really talking to them about your needs and explaining how you work and who you are and where you're going. And for people to speak up more, because I think a lot of people take a lot of abuse from people who are trying to help and are good-natured, but are essentially, implementers that are causing, inefficiencies in the system. But it's more communication and more discussion, so.
So on that note, I think we've just about come to the end of our time. Thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you very much to the panelists for being frank and open and sharing your experiences. I think there is a lot for folks to draw on here. So thank you.